Cities After is a bi-monthly podcast about the future of cities. Grounded in our daily urban struggles, it is part dystopian and part utopian. My intention is to entice your civic imagination into action, because we know that a more just and sustainable urban future is possible. This is Miguel Robles-Duran, and I dare you to imagine our cities after.
COVID, global warming, gentrification,
exploitation,
homelessness, racism,
colonialism,
patriarchy,
hunger,
police brutality,
private property,
Capitalism. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work.
In today's episode, I will talk about the startling urban socio-environmental consequences of mass tourism before, during, and after the pandemic. I will do so by emphasizing four key contradictions. 1. The global privatization of local cultures. 2. Labor, technology, and digitalization. 3. Alienation in the production of infinite spectacles. And 4. The environmental needs and its destruction. In a 2017 study conducted at Harvard's Center for International Development, sponsored by the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, tourism is defined as the buying of goods and services in another place that is not your primary residence. From this standpoint, tourism is an elemental component of global trade. Right up there with oil and gas, the chemical industry, industrial manufacturing, and agriculture. According to this study, tourism as an industry exists only in the transaction of foreign commodities for the purpose of surplus accumulation. The authors even went to the extent to emphasize that it didn't matter much what was sold to foreign visitors, as long as they would pay with money earned elsewhere. The Harvard MasterCard Joint Research Centers proposed to look at tourism at the scale of global trade, including all types of expenditures ranging from communication and transportation to medical care and clothing to educational services, as well as important parts of several other economic sectors such as real estate, culture, construction, agriculture, and food production, loans, credits, and other finance mechanisms, commercial handling, and the multiplicity of commodity value chains in all their productive and circulation activities. In short, tourism as a key component of the ever-expanding capitalist totality. And this is precisely the point of entry I want to use to present some insights into the contemporary state of mass tourism. So this study cult-like focus on the unlimited growth and surplus outputs of tourism as commodities blatantly ignores the exacerbating social inequalities, the environmental havoc and exploitative labor conditions that have been at the center of the tourist industry for decades, if not centuries. I take this reductionist view as a perfect example of how neoclassical economists, capitalists, and their loyal army of managers and bureaucrats have determined the dominant value in learning, exploring, and getting to know other cultures, urban territories, and natures. This is the dominant view of the world that has given us all the dimensional planetary disaster we now inhabit. And if not seriously challenged, it will render even more dire ecological and social catastrophes. The idea of tourism as the ultimate leisure activity has been expertly marketed as a positive and beneficial industry for humankind, freely allowing international capital to occupy, seize, and privatize foreign territories, natural resources, and cultures, and these without much resistance. And at the core of this is the manufacturing of new perverse desires for leisure. This is an emphasis on the values and virtues of instant gratification of the experience, which is the elemental social fuel of the tourist industry in itself. the ceaseless production of new desires prepackaged to sell the experience of an image. In short, the production of spectacle, which was defined by the French Marxist theorist Guy Debord in his 1967 book, The Society of the Spectacle, as it follows. I quote, "The spectacle is capital to such a degree of accumulation that it becomes an image. The spectacle is not a collection of images, but a social relation among people mediated by images. As an indispensable decoration of the objects produced today, as the general exposé of the rationality of the system, as the advanced economic sector which directly shapes a growing multitude of image objects, the spectacle is the main production of present-day society. The spectacle originates in the loss of unity of the world, and the gigantic expansion of the modern spectacle expresses the totality of this loss. It is the common language of separation. The spectacle reunites the separate, but reunites them as separate. The spectacle within society corresponds to a concrete manufacture of alienation." I end quotes. Flourishing alienation makes contemporary tourism possible, as it converts into a social desire to escape the boring and exploitative conditions of everyday life in capitalism. In this way, tourism has the potential to offer endless imaginaries of paradise, dreamscapes and disconnections from reality, of extending social alienation into the realm of temporalities. However, once there, one most likely will find itself even more alienated, as the paradise full of margaritas and caipirinhas and sculpted hard, tanned bodies only existed in the production of the spectacular images that lured the tourist into its baits. If you really want the experience, you will need to pay more. But somehow, even then, the experience is unauthentic, forged, and spurious, something like Disneyland. Tourism's innate capacity to alienate is also aggravated by the more unequal our society becomes, by today's tragically uneven concentration of wealth into the hands of the few. In this case, tourism is consumed by the alienated masses to project an upper status. Flying first class, staying at 5 or 7-star hotels, hiring personal tour guides, chauffeurs, and dining in Michelin-starred restaurants has become the idealization of the paradise of dreamscapes that were promised by leisure to the dissatisfied. This aspirational quality permits a seemingly limitless search for unique and luxurious or exotic experiences. And thanks to a few billionaires, we can now add space tourism to this aspirational mix. For this reason, the speed of capital turnover in the tourist industry is so high, and why tourism is so attractive for capitalists. Seemingly infinite services can be creatively invented to fulfill the growing social desires of separation. Tourism, according to Guy Debord, is fundamentally nothing more than the leisure of going to see what has become banal. And the very economic organization of visits to millions of places and the consumption of infinite experiences, it's already in itself the warranty of their homogenizing banality. The very idea that there is no limit to the possible offers makes this dominant form of tourism a highly unsustainable industry from any perspective possible. From the economic, labor, social, urban, and environmental perspective, the pandemic has given us many insights into how unsustainable mass tourism really is. From an economic perspective, we all can infer that the tourist industry was heavily impacted by the pandemic. But as I started researching the topic, I was blown away by the economic data I was reading. The impact was indeed of colossal proportions. Before the pandemic, tourism was the third largest sector of the global economy. It was considered a bottomless goldmine for capitalists and investors alike, and was referred as one of the fastest growing industries, with a size equivalent to 10% of the total global gross domestic product, or GDP, only to expand infinitely. Projections saw international tourism arrivals increasing by 43 million per year, reaching peak levels of 1.8 billion by the year 2030. Well, so much for these projections. According to data from the United Nations World Tourism Organization, international tourist arrivals dropped to 381 million in 2020, down from 1.4 billion in 2019. Overall, a total decline of 74% compared to the previous year. But if the pre-COVID months of January and February of 2020 are excluded in these numbers, the fall in arrivals actually amounts to 84%. And in many developing countries, of course, which are heavily dependent on tourism revenues, arrivals were down all the way to 90%. Another example is that in the third quarter of revenues of Carnival Corporation, the cruise ship industry's biggest player, showed a year-to-year decline of 99.5%. That is 31 million in 2020, down from 6.5 billion in 2019. And to be expected, the most economically affected regions from the tourist freeze were Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Oceania, North Africa, and South Asia. Overall, the tourism sector of Asia and the Pacific was the hardest hit, recording a 95% fall in international arrivals in the first 5 months of 2021. Many countries in these regions are already debt burdened, and the pandemic has made it even worse. In this scenario, the International Monetary Fund assumes a deterioration of countries' fiscal positions and a sharp increase in debt. In contrast, the least affected regions were, as many of you would expect, the richest territories: North America and Western Europe. Despite an estimated loss of 1.3 trillion in global export revenues, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, which was held this July, announced that there were also winners in the collapse of the tourist industry. The major beneficiaries in absolute terms were the United States, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Switzerland. According to the conference, these countries have high levels of tourists and high vaccination rates, thus pushing developing countries to carry the greatest economic burden. The conference also estimated that globally, the blow to international tourism given by COVID-19 has caused a loss in GDP of more than 4 trillion only for the years 2020 and 2021. To make matters even worse, both the United Nations World Trade Organization and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, do not expect international tourism to return to pre-COVID arrival levels until 2024. In fact, nearly half of the experts see a return on late 2024 or even further. And this is considering that no other COVID variant will emerge, of course. Already in October 2020, the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, and the G20 tourism ministers recognized in the Diriyah communique that COVID-19 may result in a total paradigm shift for the travel and tourism sectors. 1 year later, it has become even more clear that many tourist offers will not be able to survive the prolonged impact of the pandemic and will disappear. And what about the social impact? Well, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, characterizes the tourism sector as constituted by low skill intensity and high degree of informality, which is due in part to its seasonality, of course combined with weak regulations and enforcement. According to the IMF, a large number of workers tend to be employed in the sector on a part-time or occasional basis, or as an additional job, and the sector is characterized by a high turnover. The IMF also notes that in some countries, there is a significant share of migrant workers in the sector, notably lower wage workers from neighboring countries or workers from rural areas within the same country. For example, they estimate that 16% of tourist workers in the European Union and 20% in the United States are foreigners. That's very high. In Australia, the tourism and hospitality industry are one of the largest users of temporary work visas. In Thailand, they estimate that a fifth of the workers in hospitality come from lower wage neighboring countries, such as Cambodia, Laos, or Myanmar. This hit on migrant workers has also driven down remittances to their countries of origin, which were a very important source of income to the many families the workers have left behind. Over the years, the workforce composition of tourism has been part of the capitalist propaganda that presents tourism as a blessing for those in economic need. According to this propaganda, tourism is an industry that offers a proper livelihood to the poorest segment of the population, employing, of course, many women and young people, and offer them a serious way out of poverty. Thus, the continuous provision of incentives to this industry is key for the eradication of poverty in underdeveloped countries. This is what they would say. But if we truly look at this workforce composition with a Marxist lens, we know that under capitalism, surplus accumulation or profit is realized by the guaranteed and sustained exploitation of labor power, by the high availability of unskilled, unorganized labor in poor countries, and that makes tourism even more profitable. In an article by George Liodakis, a Greek professor of political economy, he argues that the accumulation of capital in tourist sectors is largely determined by a sheer exploitation of wage labor and often informal immigrant or slave labor in the sweatshops of what he calls tourism and the extensive free appropriation of non-commodified labor, social or cultural resources, and of course, non-human nature, ecological resources. According to him, the accumulation of capital takes place on the ground of new, continuously expanding frontiers of commodification, new forms of labor exploitation, resource appropriation, and ever new tourist destinations. According to the World Bank, as many as 100 million direct tourism jobs are at high risk of disappearing. And the World Travel and Tourism Council estimates that up to 174 million jobs are at risk globally. Not to mention the many industry sectors that are heavily dependent on tourism, such as food service, small businesses, markets, handcrafts, and other goods commonly bought by tourists. As other historical crises have shown, the unskilled labor force will most likely not find employment anytime soon. And the skilled labor force that lost their jobs will be assumed that they will be reemployed in a completely different sector of the economy, but most certainly with their wages devalued. To put it bluntly, the working class majority which supported the high revenues of the tourist industry are the ones bearing the socioeconomic consequences of this unsustainable industry. Meanwhile, the leaders of the tourist industry continue to strategize for the next forms of exploitation. There is one more thing I want to talk about before we look at what is to be done, and that is the environmental impacts of the tourist industry. Just before the pandemic, Worldwide CO2 emissions from commercial flights were rising up to 70% faster than predicted by the United Nations. And it was expected that airplane emissions of carbon dioxide would triple by 2050. According to an analysis of the International Council on Clean Transportation, the carbon dioxide emitted by airlines had increased by a staggering 32% from 2013 to 2018. It has been also estimated that the airline industry is responsible for more than 5% of global warming. What was even more worrying is that these numbers were projected to multiply. The International Civil Aviation Organization had projected that emissions from air travel would grow between 300 and 700% by 2050, and this is absolutely crazy. Just before the pandemic, there were more than 2,500 flights over North Atlantic in any given day. And that is just one air corridor. Apart from CO2 emissions, jetliners obviously generate noise pollution, and the airport zones are heavy soil and ocean and water body polluters. And this is due to the extensive handling of jet fuels and other kinds of chemicals. And these are just activities related to the airline industry. If we add them up to the car and bus transit industries, the way it produces space as it builds necessary infrastructures for the operation of the hospitality industry, hotels and the constructions in coast and urban regions, the trash generated through concentrated tourist consumption, and we can easily picture how environmentally unsustainable mass tourism really is. The competition amongst different tourist regions and industries imply a massive territorial occupation and transformation that exacerbate, of course, the exploitation of nature. Do you remember the viral pictures of the Venice canals full of dolphins swimming in less polluted, almost transparent waters? I think these were beautiful images that were nothing but a direct consequence of no tourists during the shutdown. The pandemic reminded us how our cities and natural reserves were without the sudden impact of mass tourism. It was a unique opportunity to appreciate daily life without tourists and to reflect on the socio-environmental brunt that it had created. According to figures from Carbon Monitor, last year, emissions from aviation fell by nearly 50%. But sadly, those numbers are expected to rebound as the industry goes back to what they call a normal for continuous growth through exploitation. And yes, there is ecotourism, which is commonly lauded as the industry's environmental solution. However, the same coercive competition, transport infrastructure, and direct or indirect labor exploitation continue to be at its core. After all, it is still a capitalist operation. Besides, ecotourism has been positioning as a luxury commodity, available only to the top polluters of the world, the rich citizens of advanced economies. It's a small and highly competitive niche of mass tourism that requires direct government incentives and policy changes to succeed. Think of Costa Rica or now Thailand, which have been spending high amounts of political and finance capital to convert and market its natural resources, specifically to wealthy tourists. And of course, offering to purify their environmental guilt in just a few days. As it stands today, ecotourism thrives as a higher value added form that segments class consumption patterns and greenwashes what is fundamentally wrong about the tourist industry worldwide. So, what is to be done? With such a collapse at sight, one would expect that the nation states and supranational organizations such as the United Nations, World Bank, World Trade Organization, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the International Monetary Fund, as well as all the international think tanks would come together to completely rethink the whole tourist industry for better years ahead. Well, so far, under the pressure of politicians, investors, and the industry at large, mostly of the neoliberal powers, have offered a series of strategic recommendations on how to save the industry. And by saving, they mean bringing it to its economic output back to pre-pandemic levels. The IMF, World Bank, and institutions alike are asking nation states for supportive monetary and financial policies, which are aimed at creating a favorable environment for borrowers, and that can help support affected firms. Of course, what they refer to as a favorable business environment commonly falls into the provision of fiscal incentives, the loosening of restrictions, and then, of course, those include environmental and even more deregulation of labor markets. One recommendation of the United Nations World Tourism Organization was actually to reduce labor market rigidities, not only to strengthen competitiveness, but also to allow for any needed sector reallocation. They said that flexible labor policy and these arrangements can help ensure competitive unit labor costs, especially, and get this, in countries with strong unionization. In short, the United Nations was advocating for union busting. Another recommendation from the International Monetary Fund this time is to push the exploitation of natural reserves to further expand exports, so to offset the economic of any long-term tourism decline. Private global think tanks such as Kearney are recommending to identify new business opportunities, specifically the construction of new landmarks or museums inspired by disaster sites that have taken advantage of memorials to attract tourists, such as Ground Zero and the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. And so that you believe me, let me quote to you what they say. I open the quotes. With the current pandemic having unleashed a huge wave of innovation in the future, countries might consider acknowledging these and other efforts to fight the disease with landmarks, museums, or scientific and educational facilities. Some museums are already building their coronavirus collections, for example, collecting photographs, personal items from the citizens with COVID to detail the current crisis. End of quote. They're actually suggesting that. What all these neoliberal bodies agree on is that there is an urgent need to diversify resources away from tourism, and also a dramatic shift into the digital world. Now, digitalization and technological innovation in tourism services are indeed expected to grow considerably. This includes the development of contactless payments, contactless services, more virtual experiences, augmented reality, real-time information, and of course, a higher use of automation, which obviously constitutes a crazy contradiction, as many of these neoliberal recommendations pitch digitalization as a way to help facilitate greater access to jobs and opportunities to women and low-income populations. So, adding to these many recommendations, the industry has started to organize global forums to discuss together how to recover faster. Just last month, the United Nations World Trade Organization celebrated in Cabo Verde, the second edition of the Global Tourism Investment Forum, where business leaders, entrepreneurs, and investors, with a very special focus on what they call innovation, were invited to talk with government leaders about the recovery of the industry. And of course, benefit from unique networking opportunities. Investors present in this space included RIU Group, Aguaduna, Key QB Tech Electromobility, TUI or TUI Care Foundation, Grupo Piñero, Fundación Metrópoli, etc. Basically, all of them with long-lasting histories of labor and environmental exploitation. So, all of these neoliberal bodies, whether they are nation-states, supranational organizations, or think tanks, have become uber-powerful agents for the promotion of private capitalist interests. We all know that. They exist to lobby and help implement neoliberal policies of fiscal deregulation, labor flexibilization, privatization, and private finance. They work to boost loans and credits and as a means to achieve the growth that has been projected, and shift the labor and material infrastructure conditions needed for more and more surplus extraction. So, what about anti-capitalist proposals to reimagine how we explore and get in touch with other territories and cultures of the world? Socio-environmental forms of tourism have existed for decades, but they sadly remain largely unknown and very small, as they do not participate at the same logic of the global economy. They emphasize cooperative production, symbiotic relationship to nature, socially productive involvements with other cultures, co-learning activities, and other forms of non-commodified leisure. It seems to me that what is needed is to confront the global tourism industry from two general directions. One, to directly participate in the dismantling of neoliberal institutions. And two, to support the multiplication of truly sustainable activities. This is a simultaneous protest and action. In the next episode, I will be having a conversation about how Barcelona is strategizing a serious battle against the recently approved airport expansion. And at the same time, how have they been rethinking tourism for almost a decade? And how do they trust that they will be able to offer a truly social and environmentally sustainable ways for people to visit their wonderful city? So until next episode, thank you very much for listening.
This was another episode of Cities After. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to subscribe.